Before we talk about the moment a waiter's arrogant smile turned into shock, let's go back to the day he made a mistake he would regret forever. It was a busy evening at the restaurant. The smell of expensive dishes filled the air. The sound of clinking glasses echoed through the room, and waiters moved swiftly between tables, catering to well-dressed customers. Then, an old man walked in. His clothes were faded, his shoes scuffed. He wasn't the kind of customer the restaurant was used to serving. The young waiter took one look at him and smirked. He didn't see a man, he saw an inconvenience. Someone who didn't belong. Instead of welcoming him, he mocked him. Instead of offering a seat, he humiliated him in front of others. The old man quietly walked away that night, but what the waiter didn't know was that in just a few days he would walk back through those doors, not as a customer, but as the owner. Before we talk about the moment the waiter realized his biggest mistake, let's talk about the two people whose lives were about to change forever. The first was Mr. James Carter, an elderly man who carried himself with quiet dignity. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding, but there was something about him, an air of wisdom, of patience. He had lived a full life, one filled with success, happiness, and hardship. Once he had owned a thriving chain of restaurants, respected in the industry. But life had taken everything from him. A dishonest business partner had stolen his fortune, bad investments had wiped out his savings, and the sudden loss of his wife had broken him completely. Now, James was just another man struggling to get by. But even with worn-out shoes and a simple coat, he never lost his self-respect. He believed that circumstances didn't define a person. Character did. And then there was Ryan, the waiter. Young, arrogant, and full of himself, Ryan believed the world revolved around money. He treated wealthy customers like royalty, showering them with fake smiles and endless compliments. But when it came to those who looked poor, he had no patience, no kindness, only disdain. He assumed people without expensive suits or fancy watches weren't worth his time. Ryan had worked at the restaurant for 2 years and had already gained a reputation for mocking those he deemed unworthy. He thought he was untouchable, that the world worked in his favor. He had no idea that in just a few days he would be standing in front of the one man he had humiliated, this time as his boss. Before we talk about the moment the waiter's arrogance shattered, let's talk about the night he made a mistake he would never forget. The restaurant was busy, filled with laughter, conversation, and the aroma of expensive meals. The staff moved swiftly, attending to guests, making sure every detail was perfect. And then James walked in. He didn't look like the usual clientele. His clothes were simple, his shoes had seen better days, and he carried himself with a quiet humility. He approached a table near the window and sat down, glancing at the menu. Ryan noticed him immediately. With a smirk, he walked over and picked up the menu before James could even touch it. "Are you lost, old man?" Ryan asked, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few chuckled. James looked up, confused. "I'd like to order something to eat." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and can you even afford anything here?" He held up the menu mockingly. "You know, this isn't a soup kitchen." More laughter. James felt the sting of humiliation, but remained calm. "I have money," he said, pulling out a few bills. Ryan scoffed. "Oh, wow, a few crumpled bills. Impressive." He leaned down. "How about this? You take that somewhere else, maybe a fast food place?" James stared at him, his eyes calm yet piercing. "I'd like to order." Ryan rolled his eyes, grabbed a cheap side dish from a nearby table, and slammed it in front of him. "There, it's on the house. Now hurry up and eat before you scare away the real customers." Some people in the restaurant watched in discomfort, but no one spoke up. The manager? He looked the other way. This wasn't the first time Ryan had treated someone like this. James sat there for a moment, taking in the situation. Then, without another word, he stood up, placed his money on the table, and walked out the door. Ryan laughed. "That's what I thought." But what he didn't know was that this wasn't over. Not even close. Before we talk about the moment the restaurant staff realized the truth, let's talk about who Mr. James Carter really was. James wasn't just a struggling old man. He had once been one of the most successful restaurant owners in the city. He had built a thriving business from scratch, turning small diners into luxurious restaurants. His name had been respected in the industry, and his restaurants had been known for their exceptional service and quality. But then, tragedy struck. A dishonest business partner stole millions from him, leaving him bankrupt. The betrayal was devastating. At the same time, a bad investment wiped out what little he had left. Then, as if fate had one final blow to deal, his wife passed away. The heartbreak left him lost. He had gone from being a respected businessman to a man with nothing. But what Ryan didn't know was that James had never lost his mind or his experience. Even in his struggles, he never gave up. For years, he had been working quietly, trying to rebuild. He had connections, experience, and the trust of powerful investors. All he needed was one opportunity. And just days after the humiliation in that restaurant, that opportunity came. An old friend, a wealthy investor, reached out. The friend had been following James's story and believed in him. He offered James the chance to step back into the business world, this time, stronger than before. James seized the opportunity. Deals were made, investments returned, and within days, James had regained more than just his fortune. He had regained his power, and his first order of business? Buying the very restaurant where he had been humiliated. Before we talk about the moment James walked through the doors as the new owner, let's talk about why the restaurant was so easy to buy. The place had once been thriving, but behind the fancy decor and expensive menu, it was falling apart. The management was weak, allowing employees like Ryan to treat customers poorly. Many wealthy customers had stopped coming due to bad service, but the staff never realized why. Bills piled up. Investors grew impatient. The current owner, desperate to avoid bankruptcy, decided to sell the restaurant to the highest bidder. A buyer came forward, offering an irresistible deal. The owner accepted immediately. The sale was completed in record time. And just like that, James Carter became the new owner. But no one knew yet. Not Ryan, not the staff, not even the manager. They were about to find out in the most unexpected way. Before we talk about the moment Ryan's world crumbled, let's talk about the day everything changed. It was an ordinary morning at the restaurant, but something felt different. The staff had been buzzing about a big announcement. The restaurant had been sold, and the new owner was arriving today. No one knew much, only that the previous owner had finalized the deal quickly. Ryan, as usual, didn't care. "Whoever the new owner is, they better know how lucky they are to have me," he said smugly, adjusting his uniform in the mirror. "This place wouldn't survive without me." The staff stood near the entrance, waiting for the new boss to arrive. Some whispered nervously, others hoped for a fresh start. Ryan, however, leaned against the counter, arms crossed, unbothered. "Watch, it's probably some rich guy who's never worked a day in his life." He laughed. Then the doors opened, and in walked James Carter. He was calm, composed. His posture was the same, his face unreadable. But this time, he wasn't wearing his old, worn-out coat. He was dressed sharp, in a tailored suit, looking every bit the man he used to be. Ryan's smirk didn't fade immediately. In fact, he laughed. "Oh man, this is hilarious," he said. "What are you doing back here, old man? You lost again?" No one else laughed. The restaurant manager cleared his throat, looking at Ryan with wide eyes full of warning. Ryan frowned. "What?" he asked, looking around. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" Then the manager spoke. "Ryan, I'd like you to meet our new owner." Ryan's smile disappeared instantly. His face turned pale. He froze, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. The poor old man he had humiliated days ago was now his boss. Silence filled the room. The other staff members watched in shock, barely able to believe it themselves. James finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady. I see some familiar faces here, he said, scanning the room. Then, his eyes landed on Ryan. And I see one in particular who made quite the impression on me. Ryan felt his throat go dry. Everything he had done, every cruel word, every humiliating laugh, it all came crashing down on him at once. And for the first time in his life, he was the one afraid. Before we talk about the moment Ryan faced the biggest decision of his life, let's talk about how James chose to handle his power. Everyone expected revenge. The staff had seen how Ryan treated James before. They had heard the insults, seen the humiliation. They wouldn't be surprised if James fired him on the spot. But James wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he walked through the restaurant looking around, taking in the space that was now his. This place has potential, he said thoughtfully. But something's been missing. The staff stayed silent, unsure of what to expect. Then James turned back to them. Respect. Ryan swallowed hard. James continued. I've spent my life in the restaurant business. I've seen places thrive and I've seen places fail. And do you know what makes the difference? He paused, letting the silence sink in. How you treat people. Ryan looked down, avoiding eye contact. James turned toward him. That includes customers. That includes your coworkers. That includes everyone who walks through those doors. Ryan felt a sinking feeling in his chest. Then James did something no one expected. He didn't fire Ryan. Instead, he gave him a choice. You have two options, James said, his tone firm but not cruel. You can stay here, but things will be different. You'll treat every customer with respect, no matter how they look. You'll prove that you deserve to work here. Ryan blinked. And the second option? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James's expression didn't change. You can leave right now. If you refuse to change, there's no place for you here. The restaurant fell completely silent. Ryan looked around. The staff was watching him closely. Some had small, satisfied smirks. Others looked at him with pity. He had expected rage and revenge, but instead he was being given a chance to be better. For the first time in his life, Ryan felt shame. He thought about all the people he had humiliated. He thought about how easily he could have been in James's shoes. And suddenly, he realized he didn't want to be that person anymore. Slowly he nodded. I'll stay, he said, voice quiet. James nodded once. Then prove it. And with that, the entire staff applauded, because they finally had a leader worth following. Before we talk about the lasting impact of this story, let's talk about the lesson behind it all. James Carter had walked into that restaurant as a customer, hoping for kindness, but was met with humiliation instead. Life had tested him, stripped him of everything, but it had never taken away his dignity. Ryan, on the other hand, had believed that money determined a person's worth. He had looked down on others, never realizing that life has a way of humbling people when they least expect it. In the end, James didn't seek revenge. He taught a lesson in humility. He could have fired Ryan, humiliated him in return, but instead, he chose to give him a chance to change. And that's the real message here. Never judge people by their appearance. Life can change in an instant. How you treat others today may determine who stands above you tomorrow. Because respect isn't about wealth, it's about character. And as James walked out of that restaurant, now its owner, he knew one thing for sure. The world is always watching, and how you treat people will always come back to you, one way or another.